some of these things that we have feelings about money are about experiences that we had when we were young. And these are things that we don't always consider because they weren't our experience necessarily. Or we spent a lot of our youth in a relatively homogenous background, and then only now as adults are we sort of in a more varied community, right? And I find that sometimes people in non-monogamous dating are in that more varied community for the first time.
Welcome to Normalizing Non-Monogamy, the podcast where we interview incredible people from all over the world to hear their personal journeys of self-discovery through the lenses of love, sex, and relationships.
Our mission is to show people that they're not alone and to inspire them to embrace their true selves so that together we can open minds and live authentically without shame.
We believe everyone's story is powerful and beautiful, yet it's important to remember that everyone does life a little bit differently and that the views and opinions expressed by our guests do not necessarily reflect our own.
Additionally, we aren't doctors. Please consult a medical professional for anything regarding your health that you might learn about on the show. Enjoy!
Hi, and welcome to Ask Us Anything. I'm Meshai, and we're here with Fin. We're really excited to include the lovely Laura Boyle in today's episode. She's the creator of the Ready for Polyamory website. She also has a new book coming out that I'm really excited to talk about. Once I went through her website, I was like, all the things, please, yeah. I am a relationship coach with Expansive Connection, and I'm a certified in sex therapy and trauma therapy. So that makes me sort of kind of qualified to have 2 cents and to then tell them to other people. So we're really excited. Thank you guys so much for all of your questions. And I'm ready to get into it.
Yeah, we got 3 awesome questions today. Before we do jump in, I'll just tell you on my end, what makes me marginally qualified for this is that I host the Normalizing Non-Monogamy podcast that you're listening to right now with Emma. We've been doing it for over 6 years. We've talked to hundreds of people. We've also been living in our own world of non-monogamy in various forms for 17 or more years. And I also completed a sex and relationship coaching program in March. So My credentials are not quite as professional, but they are layered and deep. How about that?
They are layered and deep, and you are amazing because you have a whole community and this whole thing you've built. So I would say that you are definitely qualified.
Well, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
And Laura, welcome back. You are on episode 279, sharing your personal story. And you also have your own podcast and you do a bunch of writing and you've written a book. So welcome. We'd love to have you introduce yourself and what makes you marginally qualified, which is all we strive for here on the show.
Marginally.
Thank you so much for having me. So my name is Laura Boyle. I am, as Meshai said, the creator of Ready for Polyamory, the blog and the podcast. Some of you may know me from that. I am an author. My book, Monogamy in This Economy, is coming out soon.
Yeah.
And it is all about the sort of nuts and bolts of when folks decide to create multi-partner households. And I really enjoyed getting to do the research for that. I made a survey. Folks were nice enough to respond to it. Almost 500 people responded.
Wow.
And I am very humbled by that amount of response because I got to turn all of those people's stories and responses into this book. And so that, to some extent, makes me qualified to talk about today's topics because we're talking about finances and some of those nuts and bolts. And that's a couple of chapters of the book. Mm-hmm. But in general, also, I have been non-monogamous for nearly 20 years. I do coach folks who are in non-monogamous and also other forms of kind of non-traditional and expansive relationships. I have a coaching certification. I've been doing that for almost 5 years now. And I teach classes about non-monogamy as well.
Awesome.
You've been upgraded. You're more than marginally qualified.
I don't know. I mean, it's all the same, right?
You've been promoted. Amazing.
Right. I finished a couple of levels of Gottman certification, so now I'm
there. You go.
Right?
I like it.
Amazing. Maybe a few other quick thoughts before we jump in. Yeah, today's conversation or questions are all about finances around non-monogamy or just even finances in general. And I will say I'm excited about this topic because I besides all my experience in non-monogamy, I spent solid like 7-8 years, like deep diving into personal finance. So this is my other nerd passion is personal finance and tax, like tax strategies for individuals. So I have a nerdier side on the money side, but I'm going to try to reel it in today and not give all of like the tax nuts. And well, maybe I'll sneak a few in.
Or you could. Like,
right.
I feel like with at least some of this, that could be really valuable to the folks here. I start off the finance chapter of the book by going, this is not financial advice. Please see your financial advisor for real financial advice.
I think that's a great place to start here,
what
too.
Some other people did.
Yes.
Yeah.
And that might help you start with some strategies and some good questions to ask an actual financial advisor who knows your actual situation.
Perfect.
We do not.
That's correct.
The internet at large does not. A book that says some general things does not.
Exactly. Yes. And I will say my years of studying on my own while I was supposed to be working another job, do not make me a CPA or any type of financial, advice giver other than for anecdotal entertainment purposes, edutainment purposes. Yeah.
Yeah. Right. We're giving you some good places to start.
I'm just staying quiet because I'm definitely going to be the person that's like, I just want all the answers. I don't have like any particular like weight in this game at all, but I'm definitely with everyone else where it's like, how do you do this? And
you have money and you spend money, so at least you have experience with it.
I have experience. That's correct.
Look, I have ADHD and money sometimes. It runs straight through my pocket. But I have good strategies for talking to your partners about it when you've done that.
I love a good set of tools. Yeah.
Yeah. Amazing. All right. Well, then maybe we jump into today's first question. And I will say all of our questions today, once again, came from within our virtual community, which is a paid community that we have that Emma and I run. There's over 300 people in there supporting each other all the time. The questions don't have to come from there, but that's typically where they come from. So thank you to everybody in our community for sending these in. Very much appreciate it. All right. First question.
I would like to get your perspective on when it is appropriate to bring up the topic of finances as a relationship becomes more serious. I imagine there could be stages to this. Early conversations might be more about each person's attitude toward financial topics like budgeting, saving, and splurging. But at some point, it's probably wise to dig a little deeper. What are the guidelines and boundaries you would suggest?
So people had dramatically different answers about this. And I would just note that the only thing that's definitely carried through is that you don't want these conversations to start while you're moving in together.
Okay.
Right? People who put it off until it was an absolute necessity had a much harder time than people who started conversations about their values around money, about their tendencies around money earlier.
Okay.
So whether that starts in the form of while you're dating, who wants to pay for things and why, and what the emotional parts of that earlier, and then you build on that in terms of as you become more intimate with someone, talking about where that comes from. And I think that's not necessarily an escalation in your relationship sort of thing. There's no formula, but because nothing is going to work perfectly for the next two people as it does for you. I can't give you a when you're 6 months in, you definitely should be having this exact same conversation kind of timing. But I think as soon as you're spending money with someone, you should start having conversations about who's paying for what and why.
Mm-hmm.
And then at some point when things get more intimate, you can start talking about your values around money. Right? But that's my 2 cents. That's not really a survey borne out or research borne out kind of commentary.
Yeah. Yeah. What has worked for you in the past, I guess, or how do you typically, if you get into a new partnership or something like that, when is it or what is sort of the path that you've sort of followed for this?
I think it's varied dramatically in my different relationships. And in some of them, it's been much more successful than others. Right?
Yep. Yeah.
And I wasn't joking earlier when I was I'm the ADHD person who's super impulsive with my money. And the clearer I am with people about that, the more successful it is to have them understand what my strengths and weaknesses with money are.
Mm-hmm.
And that's important when I want to have long-term goals with someone. As someone who is not a like relationship escalator person, but who occasionally uses things like vacations as a milestone with people, saying like, I want to use that as a milestone, so let's do some planning around that. That takes financial planning.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So I need to work with people to do that, but I can't do that if I'm then going to let money burn a hole in my pocket. So we need to work together.
Yeah. 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 Meshai, what's been your experience with this, or how do you typically think about this one?
I think like typically for at least with my experience, it's been like normal monogamous dating kind of payment structures. Like, oh, I want to take you out, I might be paying for this, or if you want to come to this, do we want to split it? Then I think when you get to things like milestones, whether it's birthdays or holidays or like taking vacations together, that's when the conversations around how we actually function around money, what gets allocated where, starts to get a little deeper, and beginning to talk about people's financial like strengths and weaknesses or how they view money starts to become more apparent. And I think that's kind of like when it starts to get like, okay, we have to sit down and talk about this now.
Yeah, I think on my end, like if it's dating in the maybe like locally, or you're just going to go out to dinner or something, that's a thing that I think is, it can be awkward to bring up, but also I think important, right? So you're not like, hey, let's go to this 5-star Michelin restaurant and neither of you can afford it, but you're trying, right? Or one of you can and one of you's feeling really bad about it. And so I think sometimes like for me talking about those things up front, like, hey, what type of stuff do you like to go do? What type of budget typically works, or how often? Even just having like a high level understanding of what somebody else's like capacity is, I think is really helpful. And also, what is their strategy around, who pays for stuff? Because some people have this very like, oh, the man always pays, or there's like, well, we split everything, or I'm not letting a man pay for me. So there's all sorts of like different, I think, mindsets around money. And even if you talk about them, I think at a high level early on, I think is a really helpful thing to be able to do. At least it helps me know that I'm not like accidentally pushing somebody outside their comfort zone, or somebody's going to pull me way outside of mine. So that's sort of, at least I know those are like maybe the easier ones than like we're thinking about moving in and taking out a mortgage together and buying a home. But I think sometimes like if you can start normalizing the conversation early, it helps to me as things grow, or if things grow, for money to not always be a taboo topic in relationships.
And normalizing those conversations makes it easier to understand someone's reaction when later you get to a point where, oh, I see why they want more visibility on some of these household expenses. Yeah. They'd rather it was in a joint account that we both see than that I'm Venmoing them for every single little thing.
Yeah.
Right? They have lower anxiety if we do that, because they talked to me early on about how they prefer not to split, but to cover a greater amount of things because they get anxiety about this or that thing, right? Like some of these things that we have feelings about money are about experiences that we had when we were young.
Yeah.
And these are things that we don't always consider because they weren't our experience necessarily. Or we spent a lot of our youth in a relatively homogenous background, and then only now as adults are we sort of in a more varied community, right? And I find that sometimes people in non-monogamous dating are in that more varied community for the first time.
Yeah. Yeah, I think I love what you said there, Laura. And I think what's interesting too is it's so easy to make assumptions about people, right? Like, oh, I know this person has a really high paying job, so obviously they're going to be okay spending money. But right, like you said, we don't know what their background is. Maybe they grew up in a home where there was never a financial stability, and so they like hoard money like crazy to feel safe, and they're probably more frugal and harder to spend money than somebody who maybe has a fraction of it. So like we don't know what people's financial histories or relationships to money are. And again, not that you have to like roll that all out on date number one, but even just kind of like starting to understand
Right. So that then in 6 months or a year, when you're getting deeper with them, you have a better understanding of where they're coming from.
Right. Yeah. So on your 1-year anniversary, when they get you a 30-cent card and they're like, what the hell? This guy's so cheap. What? And you have a little more context for what's going on. And yeah. Yeah. I was just going to say one other thought that came to mind is I think if it's sometimes in like a long distance partnership, some of these conversations might change a little. I think in my experience, it changed because there was the element of potentially having to travel and saying like, what does this look like for people? Like if we're going to go down the road of a long distance partnership, how realistically, how often can we see one another if we live on opposite ends of the country or opposite ends of the world, or even if we live 2 hours away and gas is super expensive? So like thinking about what are maybe the financial barriers in your partnership at that point, it might sort of speed that up a little bit, having to say like, I'm sorry, I can't afford to fly across the country more than once every 6 months. And if both people are like, well, that's not a relationship, well then have some new conversations to talk about.
Right. There are greater expenses in certain conditions than in others.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So those are just some of the thoughts I had. Yeah.
Yeah, even like how you split that up. I think that's a great one because there's a lot of us who have relationships that are long distance and having to have that conversation of like, well, it doesn't necessarily fit in the category of like casual dating where it's like, I've got you this time and you've got me next time, but it also sometimes doesn't fit into like the more serious relationship, even though the financial expenditures might be quite large. So having to have that conversation around like, well, when I say I'm coming down, are you splitting the bill with me for the place that we're staying in? And are you like driving down and how much does that cost? And like sometimes, because I don't live where you are, I don't see the expenses that you're going to incur from like coming to visit with me and things like that. And so having like those financial conversations might actually happen really early on if you're trying to see each other.
Right. It can create kind of instant intimacy in some ways to be long distance because you have some of these big important conversations that people often save for later in local relationships very early.
Yeah. Yeah, I love that what you said too, Meshai, about like sort of the hidden costs.
Absolutely.
You don't necessarily know, right, what's going on in some of those situations. So, yeah.
What did you guys think about the yours, mine, and ours like bank accountant situation that she talked about originally? She was like, I have mine, he has his money, and then his money. I don't know. Both of them had their own bank accounts, and then they had a joint one. And then whoever their extra people were like, okay, that comes out of your individual account. Have you seen like other partners who do that as well? Is that like a pretty common model?
So a lot of people who I talked to in the survey had that as a common conflict point, deciding what was a household expense and what wasn't, and dictating that dates with people outside the household, whether that's 3 people who live in the house or what, right? People who were outside the house weren't counted as a household expense. But if one of the people living in the house was the partner of like a hinge, right? And so one person who lived in the house had no outside partners, and then the other people did. And them going, oh, so you don't have this extra expense and we do, and you just have this extra money to do things that are fun for you, that causing conflict within the household. Or, for example, those people who had outside partners planning like weekends away or vacations with additional partners and then not wanting to chip in as much to the joint household's vacation because they've already planned these other weekends away. Those sorts of things being financial conflicts.
Okay. But yeah, I could see where that would be a thing. I know that like in a past relationship, I had a birthday coming up, and I remember that they definitely had a conversation with their partner about how much money they would set aside for us to have birthday fun with. And like, it definitely made me feel really thought about and cared for and all that other stuff. But like, I found it to be like kind of mind blowing that at the same time, other people were having conversations about financially how to hold space for someone else and then how that affects their overall budget. And just knowing like that it actually gets really detailed. And it's kind of like a domino effect that sometimes, like as the person on the outside, I don't actually see.
Well, right. And like on the one hand, it makes sense if you're a shared household, like you do have some visibility on each other's finances. And if, for example, it's a big purchase for a birthday or Christmas or whatever, and someone wants to splurge on their additional partners for those holidays, it kind of makes sense that you go, oh, well, I would do this out of my money, but it's a little bigger than I thought it would be because I didn't know them for the whole season I would have been saving over. Can I take some out of the shared fund? We have enough as a household, but then you have to run it past everybody, right? Like, I could see how that would cause tension potentially.
Yeah.
I mean, even as the person, like thinking about putting myself in that situation, as the person who, knowing my partner and their, ecosystem are sitting and having detailed conversations about how they can work me into their financial life, is like, there's a little part of that that's like, wow, I didn't want to have an impact on people, but like we do, right? And I think that's something to like,
right. It's an ecosystem.
Yeah. To think that you're just going to be like, oh no, I don't have any impact here in what's going on, like, is just not realistic.
Right. And on the one hand, you want to have an impact because you are part of this person's life.
Yep.
And you want it to be known that you're part of this person's life. Like, that's a great feeling.
Yeah.
Yep.
But on the other hand, it's a little icky at the same time.
Yep. I only want to have a positive impact on people's lives.
Yeah. I don't ever want to be part of the fight. I just want to be like a nice, warm fuzzy. And that's not realistic.
Right. Well, thanks for bursting my bubble, Laura. Jeez.
Sorry.
Well, should we give question number 2 a whirl?
Yeah.
My question is for the upcoming episode about finances and E&M. And it is specifically referring to the possibility that I may move in with partners that are married, have a long-standing relationship, have raised each other's children, obviously have a lot of the monogamous privileges and rights as a married couple would: a home, health insurance, pensions, all that fun stuff. What is the best avenue I should take to set myself up for financial securities on my own? Obviously, if I'm injured, if there is some sort of breakup, are there things I should watch out for and definitely do or definitely not do in this instance? I'd appreciate any feedback. Again, moving in with partners that are already married and in an established relationship. What would be the best way to financially protect myself and my future? Thank you.
I think it's such a great question. Like, I feel like there's so many people who go into this type of situation and like are excited to live with the couple and have not talked about like the nooks and crannies of financial things. And then they get in there and they're like, I just feel guilty.
Yeah, this is a great question. I could see so many things. There was like so many things going on for me. So yeah, I would love to. We'll start with the promoted expert here today.
Tell us all the things.
I mean, in some ways, your information about personal finance that you've dug deep into is probably equally or more helpful as anything that I have. I think the most interesting thing that I found while sort of researching the book is how many people, having already formed a like couple unit, did not separate any of their finances as a couple when additional people moved into their home. They just went, that would be much too complicated. We have no interest in re-separating or redoing any of these things. We understand that that's a privilege that we have, but we're not doing any of it. We're going to integrate our additional partners to whatever degree feels nice. If they want us to do joint household accounts, we'll do an additional joint household account and funnel some of our finances into that and do household expenses through that. But we're not going to separate any of our stuff.
Yeah.
Was the most common answer.
Interesting. So it's crazy because I didn't even really jump there to think about, right, that rather than it necessarily being on the person coming in, it should be on the entire ecosystem, whether it's 2, 3, 4 people that you're moving in with. But like in this situation, that maybe the married couple also takes a look at it and says, maybe we divide and become sort of 3 individuals rather than a couple and a couple plus one.
Right. And so in cases where you were 3 individuals to start, often what people did was make a household joint account that each person funneled some percentage of their income into to pay household expenses out of. And they played that game of what's a household expense, what's not a household expense, which is the most contentious game in the world. People sit down and have to do the wait, are our cars our own, or are we in a city where we don't each have a car? So is the car a household expense? If we have 2 cars for 3 people, are the 2 cars a household expense, or do 2 people individually pay for these cars? Those sorts of issues are massively contentious, and not to mention the thing of, if 2 of us have a kid, do only the 2 of us pay for those kids' expenses? Or does our third partner who's moving in and taking on parenting duties helping us pay for the kids' expenses? That's 4 chapters of this book are on parenting concerns. And they're different for everyone, but also it's wild the degree to which people come to entirely different conclusions with the same set of facts, or almost the same set of facts, because so much of it is emotionally based. And just like monogamous people are constantly creating new and different ways to step parent, and none of that is a set of advice, the same is true for polyamorous parents.
Yeah.
There is no one way to do it. But so financially, my biggest advice for someone who is moving in with a couple is the same advice I give people moving in with a boyfriend or a girlfriend. Keep some portion of your money separate so that if you separate, you still have an account to pull back into. Right? So there is some safety net to pull back into. Make sure you have your own retirement account that you are funding. And even if you're planning on eventual things like living together until forever, make sure you have a lease. If you're moving into their house, that your name is on the lease if you're all leasing together, so that it doesn't look like you didn't exist for however many years if you need to move out, because you need that history.
Yeah, that's a really great point. Even if they're sort of acting as your landlord, right? If you're moving in.
Right, but you just have a subletting agreement.
Yep.
Or a lease agreement if you're renting a room from them on the mortgage. But just protect yourself a little bit. Even if you hope that you will never move out ever, just have it on paper. Because you don't want it to be that in 3 years, in 4 years, something goes wrong and you move out and there's no proof that you ever did anything for the last 4 years and now you can't rent an apartment.
Yeah. Yeah, I love that. I think one of the thoughts that came to mind when I was listening to this is it's never really fun to think about the end of a partnership when you're doing big, exciting things like moving in or even just getting together, starting to date. But I think somebody actually on our podcast a couple of episodes ago made the comment about it's really important to talk about how you break up, because that's not something people like to think about. And it can be really important at the end of a partnership to know, okay, when we break up, this person has a history of burying themselves in the sand and disappearing. And I like to try to talk it out and really, maintain friendships. So before we take the next step, it's good to know what's coming if we hit the end. And I think this is a great example of that. You don't want to just sit and maybe dwell on the end of it, but it is important to think about there's a good chance that this could come to an end at some day, even if you don't break up, right? There might be other reasons that you have to stop living together, and to have yourself protected at that stage is, I think, really critical. So I really appreciate what you shared there, Laura.
I also really thought when you were talking about it, I was like, I don't know. for other people, but like my relationship with money, like I've had to work on it as an adult because once I became like 21, 22, I realized like I had a lot of anxiety around it. And so like, as I've worked on it, I've had to change my perspective on how I relate to it and what it means to me and like the story I tell myself. So when you were talking, I was like, when you talk to someone else about financial relationships and like who spends money, it kind of goes into like that first date conversation with other people. Like, what are you into? But like financially, how have you like individuated in E&M, but like with money, and it sounds like it very much so is about splitting hairs. And normally, like in relationship, we're talking about splitting hairs. Like, do we have like oral sex? Do we not? Is that like crossing a boundary? Is like, do we need to talk about like you sleeping or spending the night with a partner before you do it, but like with your primary partner or the person you live with? Like those type of splitting hairs, like we have to do the same thing with finances. And so if you found like a comfortable space of being able to split hairs in relationship conversations, then applying that same type of regulation or like a wider span of like, this is just part of the norm, then it might like help to calm down that fear of I'm intruding into someone else's financial makeup, where you're actually just asking what they're into and how they go about this.
Yeah, I think maybe even it seems sort of tangential to that, Meshai, is thinking about as you come into an established partnership where two people probably have norms around money, and they've got however many years of history of talking about this, navigating this, being really transparent about this. And even if you're in like a really long-term, deep committed relationship, the chances that you're like down in the weeds about your money and looking at your bank accounts together seems unlikely to me, and is probably not happening a ton. And so I think that would be a conversation I would have too, is like, okay, if I'm moving in with you, here's the level of transparency that I would need to feel good, because I'm sort of also at the mercy of, right? If they're like, let's say the other couple happens to be completely mismanaging their finances, or they're living on the edge every day, and you're moving in thinking you've got this like cozy room over your head or roof over your head, and it's really not as safe as you thought it was. So I think there's just some pieces that I would be talking to them about, to say like, hey, if I'm going to be here, this is what I would require. Are you comfortable talking at this level and amount of detail about the finances in general? Because I can't be a complete outsider if I'm sort of relying on you for a home. Like that's a pretty big responsibility.
Right. And be prepared that when they get to that level of transparency with you, it might be a shock to their system. They might have patterns and habits, and maybe one of them has always run the finances and the other one just every 6 months goes, how are things? Or like spends on the one card they're told they can spend on and doesn't really worry about it past that. And the other one makes payments as needed from the real bank account or whatever it is, right? Like whatever their system is. And doesn't think about it. And you arriving and going, let's be transparent. Let's talk in detail. Let's talk about what expenses I'm adding to the house, but also what money I'm bringing. And especially if you arriving means that all of you move into a new house, because sometimes it does. Sometimes you all move into a new space. It's not that you move into their existing home. And that's a whole bunch of changes for everybody.
Yeah.
And everybody's in a like agitated, activated state. And nobody is acting their best as that happens, as much as you'd all like to be.
Yeah. Right.
And so figuring out how to be the catalyst of that change without getting blamed for that change is not just on you, it's on them. But going in with the like, hey, I know this is going to be activating, but we need to figure out together how to do it.
Yeah.
Let's work on it. These are the things I need. These are the things that I come with. Let's work together on it. Can be more productive than just going in and going, I think you guys are a financial mess. This is my financial mess. Let's stir it.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, I would say it.
Let's stir it. But it does kind of get stirred up, no? Like if you come in, like that is literally what happens. You're going to stir the pot.
Yeah.
Right. And you don't mean to. It just happens. This is change.
Well, I think something you kind of pointed out too earlier, Laura, is like not waiting until you're moving in. And I think similarly, like don't wait to start doing this when you're like, okay, my lease has another month and a half, and then I have to get out of here. So we need to really like speed this up. Like do this when there's not a pressure cooker.
Talk about values. Talk about how you spend and how they spend 6 months before you're moving in. Spend those 6 months talking about what it's going to look like and whether you really have the money to do it and whether it's really comfortable. And then once you're there, you can figure out which numbers are attached.
Yeah.
Or what percentage you're going to put in the bank account to match the numbers you've been talking about for the last 6 months.
Yeah.
And then once you're in, you can figure out that you didn't realize, but one of you is a person who checks the bank account every single day and gets agitated by the $10 up and down, right? Because those are real conflicts that people have. Right? When you realize that one of you is the person who checks the bank account every day and gets annoyed that somebody went out to lunch and didn't tell them.
Mm-hmm.
And the other one's like, why are you controlling me?
Okay.
And so like you figure out which things you need to do on your own card so that you don't have that fight.
Yes.
Yeah.
Or what you need to do in terms of not telling each other that you check the bank account every day. Because some things are just, we don't talk about this for our own good.
Yeah.
As much as I know we as coaches and therapists and professionals don't like to tell people to not talk, sometimes you need to just not talk.
Yeah.
Forbear a little.
Right.
It's true, but every once in a while, we draw a veil. So long as you're talking about the big things, we can choose not to tell our partner about the sandwich we got at lunch sometimes.
Because it's like a personality thing, right? Like if you know that their personality can't take certain pressures over long periods of time, like that slow drip, like don't add to the slow drip. It makes sense.
Or if I am the guy who checks our bank account every single day or twice a day, maybe that's, I need to figure out how to manage that, right? Like I need to be able to check it without bringing up every charge that's ever happened.
Right. Figure out what you can do for your anxiety that isn't about your partner's behavior.
Yes.
I learned that one the hard way.
Most of us have.
That wasn't a hypothetical example.
We had to figure out. Yeah.
Yeah. A few other thoughts on this that come to mind if I were moving in and things that I would do from a financial perspective. One would be like one of the big pieces of financial advice that often gets put out there to people when they're trying to sort of stabilize is creating an emergency fund, and that looks different for everybody. Like usually people would say, give yourself 6 months of living expenses so that if something happens, you lose a job or whatever, that you have a cushion, you have a little bit of runway. But I would say the way that I was thinking about that with regards to this would be a very specific emergency fund I would give myself is whatever, like in your area, the amount of money you would need to, on a moment's notice, remove yourself from a situation. And so typically that would be your first and last month's rent, some type of a security deposit, whatever that is, and having that in a bank account somewhere that doesn't get touched. Because yes, you have a roof over your head and a home, but if something happens and you need to go and move in somewhere else, and you're all of a sudden you're like, well, I can't move out because I need $3,000 for my last month's rent, and to get out of here. And I'm moving, like, I would just, to me, it would be having sort of the go bag version of a financial sort of nest egg that is there that you can get out if you need to get out. So that was one extra thought.
And that could be something that you as a household negotiate having.
Yeah.
Like In the Polyamorous Home, which is Jess Mahler's book that came out 6 or 7 years ago, she suggests as a household, before you move in, you put together an account with enough money to split your household into 2 households. Enough money to get a moving truck and to get 2 separate apartments, whatever that costs.
Yeah. Yeah. I think that's brilliant.
I don't know anybody who actually has that much fuck you money sitting anywhere. But if you can,
Yeah.
Stick it in a bank account and split it between you.
Right.
Look, I live in Connecticut. That's like $12,000. But if you can, do it. A 2-bedroom is like $2,000 a month. So
yeah. 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 I think the other sort of blanket piece I would say is just is getting yourself educated on personal finance. And you don't have to deep dive into it to the obsessive level that I do things, but reading a few books, understanding some basic principles, that like some of these things like emergency funds, even the phrase that you just used, like "fuck you money," that's a very common phrase in like the personal finance world. And so just like learning some of the tools out there, different types of retirement accounts, what the tax benefits of them are, what are just some of the basics, so you maybe have a little bit of literacy as you're navigating this. I think there's some really great books out there that are pretty easy reads. Again, it's most people don't find it as enjoyable as I do to read about this stuff, but getting a book or two under your belt so you just have some like basic personal finance chops, I think is a really great place to just start, because you'll probably be reading things and then being like, well, how is that going to work with 3 of us, or how is that going to work, and it just might be some like thinking points for you to really be kind of mulling over as you're going through this. So that'd just be my sort of blanket advice for probably all of these people, is like get at least somewhat educated on the topic, and as best you can.
I think we looked at it from like the single person coming into the relationship. What do you think the do's and don'ts should be for the married couple?
So I think it depends what their goals are.
Okay.
Right? I think if their goal is to make the person coming in feel as equitably part of the household as possible, then your goals and actions are different than if you want to create an environment that's as stable for yourselves as possible. So if you already had some separate and some joint accounts, it's really simple. You just sort of add a third person to the joint accounts and you roll from there. But if you had an entirely joint ecosystem, which is getting less common, right? It's only like 60% of people who are low income have separate or have entirely joint accounts at all. And it's still, I mean, like, it's becoming less and less common as you get younger too, like demographically, for people to have entirely joint finances, which I think is just interesting.
Okay.
That as time rolls on, people just default to having joint finances less and less. And this is partly just because women have more rights to their finances as we go. And all of our mothers and grandmothers are telling us to keep our money to ourselves, which is fun and interesting. But that being the case, people still tend to have a joint account for household expenses. And so throwing the third person on it is not that hard. You do have to do some math about how you do that. Right? So figuring out what your household expenses are becomes the complicated question. And it gets more and more complicated the more people you add to the household and the more things are in that gray area. So when you have kids in the house, it's more complicated. When you have things that only some people think should count as a household expense, like you're updating furniture, you get people fighting about whether or not we actually need to update that.
Yeah. Yeah, I don't care about the old couch. You're the one who wants it. This is a you expense, right?
Right, exactly. Yep. And a lot of the time, these are expenses that are big enough that the person who wants it can't afford it. And so it sort of needs to be a household expense. But if you're 2 against 1 or all of these situations, in my study, massively, the most common size of household was 3 adults. Mostly, according to survey respondents, because it's just the least complicated. The more people you add, the harder it is to get everyone to agree on anything, including where to live. That's so like I keep referring to groups of 3. It's mostly because over half of the households I talked to were 3 people. But there were a bunch of groups of 4 as well. One household of 5 who I did follow-up interviews with. Any other large groups were not people I did follow-ups with. So that said, once you figure out so in the case of this married couple, you could either, if you're trying to be super equitable, divide some of your finances and have some of your own his and hers money, But
Mhm.
they're also talking all about like stuff for the kids, and they need to figure out what role they want this partner to have with their children. And I think in order to protect themselves, protect the kids, they need to like formalize that to the greatest degree possible. And that means if they want this person to be taking on a parenting role with their kids,
Mhm.
that includes talking to a family attorney, getting either medical powers written up so that this person can take their kids to the doctors or the emergency room in cases of an emergency. I understand that's not financial, but it's important.
Yeah. Yeah.
If this person is taking on a parenting role long term, that can include seeing a family attorney about getting that formalized or getting it formalized that this person isn't a parent of their kids. Because you can get parent like documentation written up that says that too. So that later when this person moves out, they can't sue and say that they were a psychological parent of these
Mm.
children for however many years and they deserve visitation and all of these things. Because in a bunch of states, depending on what kind of family court judge you get, it won't hold up. But in 38 states, you could theoretically sue and get at least partial visitation for these kids, depending on how long you lived with them and what kind of role you had. And so it's important, especially if this person is paying for the children's expenses, right? So, like showing that you paid into the groceries, showing that you paid into the kids'
Mhm.
activities after school, showing that you did pick up and drop off for school, all those things count as parent-like activities, right? So, the parents, the couple who are married, should either set very strong boundaries around those activities, those payments, what the other person is paying for and not, or, and keep separate accounts from which they pay those kid related things, the kids' doctors, all those things. Or if they're integrating them into household expenses, be prepared that that makes that person functionally a parent under many states' legal codes.
So basically, these people, if you're integrating this person into your life with kids, you definitely should be speaking to an attorney as well as thinking about finances. Yeah.
Right. And considering the like level at which you're doing that, because in case of a breakup, it will matter, or at least could.
It's all about
Yeah.
those breakups. If we just never broke up with one another, we wouldn't have any trouble, I think.
I mean, so many things in life wouldn't matter if they didn't end.
We'll do that. That's an Ask Us Anything next month, is how to make things last forever.
You solved world peace like 3 episodes ago. This one's going to be a
It hasn't caught on though, Misha. I don't know if you've been watching the news.
Yeah.
True.
They're not listening.
They just haven't listened. All right.
Question 3.
Question 3. Let's do question 3, which I think, we'll see here. It's maybe a little bit of a reiteration of some of the existing information, but I think probably some interesting twist on it as well. So here we go.
Let's pretend, and this is not an unreality here. In our case, we have separate finances. So we have yours, mine, and ours. And if my partner was going to go on a date or spend money on a separate other partner, they would use their money, as I would if I were. A lot of people are married, and some of them are monopoly. Some of them are any combination of lots of things. I'm curious how people divide the expenses up and who pays for what. Thanks.
So I thought it was interesting that people had a little bit of every kind of division of money who I talked to. There were also, in follow-up interviews, a lot of people who said that they had entirely joint finances, but then when you asked them follow-up questions, they had some separate accounts that they just didn't count in their head because, well, retirement accounts don't count or whatever, right? They had similar reasoning to that.
Right.
And so I kind of understand that because accounts that you don't touch every day don't count to them. But if only one of you is on them and the other people can't access them, those are separate accounts.
Right. Right.
And so there's a little bit of that going on. And also, I also get not counting them because they're not your everyday sort of money to play with that I was really asking the question about in the first place.
Right.
But
Right.
there was really sort of everything in terms of division of money within these households, in terms of like people who really like third and fourth partners moved in and they just merged two couples' bank accounts, put all four people on this new joint account, and we're like, nope, we are merging everything. All four people's direct deposits are going in here. We're all W-2 employees. No big deal.
Wow.
And that sounds wild to me, but I'm somebody who keeps all my money separate. And like, I'm not the target audience. And then all the way to the other end where it's like several people in a house who all have all of their money separate all of the time and are like writing each other checks or Venmoing each other for the bills.
Mhm.
Right? And I don't think that's that wild, but it did involve a lot of random calculation on the fly about groceries.
Yeah. Some of this, like, I'm just like having flashbacks to college and living in a house with like five other guys and like everybody writing their name on stuff in the fridge and like how petty it can get. Like, oh, did you use my stick of butter? Like all of those things. And I'm like, man, I would like to think
Well,
that wouldn't
right.
be it.
And like, I can see how some of these people were like, yeah, and we write some of it off, right? You just go,
Yeah.
well, I'm getting the groceries this week and you'll get them next week. But
Yeah.
at the same time, when it's things like the electric bill,
Yep.
you don't
Mhm.
write it off as easily. You do the math of at the end of the month, I got this and this, and you got that and that, and whoever didn't pay anything pays us both back.
Yeah.
And I'm like, oh, okay, I kind of get that.
Yeah. 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 I think that like what I kind of hear some of the takeaways are, Laura, is that people do this in a variety of ways. And I'm sure there are varying degrees of success and probably lots of, hey, we tried it way number one for a while, and then we transitioned to this way and then to that way. And that it's probably a little bit of a wandering path as you hone in what works for you and your
As
people.
with everything else in relationships, there's a lot of trial and error until people figure out what works for them and they stick in it.
Or that it works for a little while until the next disruption comes along, right? And
Right.
so,
Until somebody loses a job or gets a promotion
Mhm.
or moves house.
yeah, yeah. So just keep in mind these things are always in flux and rarely going to be static for.
Right. The household expenses you figured out perfectly are not the same in a year and a half when they reconfigure how much your mortgage is going to be because you've got variable interest or because the town's mill rate changes.
Yeah.
True.
Yeah.
So I think like she said, and then you said it, Finn, and then Laura said it as well, that there's like the 6-month space, like being able to talk about it like 6 months before you guys move in, and then having like maybe check-ins every 6 months about where you guys are. So it's like you both have said throughout this whole episode that like a 6-month space is like kind of desirable. So I'm not saying it's a 6-month rule or anything. However, it does sound like that's a really great gauge for someone who needs like parameters.
Yeah.
Right. I feel like for most people and most big life shifts, somewhere on the order of 4 to 6 months is long enough to see if something has worked.
Yeah.
Okay.
I love too, one of the things I love about giving yourself more time is that, you can, as you're starting to think about moving in, you talk about this 6 months out and you sleep on it for a month, and a month later you're like, it just doesn't feel right. And that gives you that time to like come back to the table and readjust rather than being like, well, I only had 2 weeks to decide and it seemed good enough at the time. And now that I've sat in it for a month, but I'm already living here and I've already pulled the trigger and done all the stuff. Like it gives you that time, I think, to see how it actually feels before you move forward in it. Because sometimes that might not come up right away. Amazing. Well, I'm super grateful for this conversation. I I love talking personal finances and money, and so it was a delight to have you on, Laura. And I also thought of a really great game show that we should probably start called "What is a Joint Expense?" or "What is a Household Expense?" And it's sort of Family Feud style. You put the two households that are living together, and you ask the question, and you see if they vote if it's household or individual.
That's awesome. Poly-Family Feud.
Look, I am ready for a kink con where I get to play Leather Family Feud and just line people up. I'm waiting for the next one that I'm at to play this game. It'll be great. But I'm willing to play Poly Family Feud where we just ask questions about what's a joint expense, what's a permissible rule, what's actually just a boundary. Like, these are great competitions to play.
Questions. I would watch it with popcorn and take notes at the same time.
Is it a boundary? Oh, that would be such a heated debate on so many things.
Is it a boundary, an agreement, or a rule? That's a Poly Family Feud game to play.
That would be brilliant.
Love it. Amazing. Well, stay tuned next month. We'll have it out. No problem.
Amazing.
Pitch it to Netflix.
I'm only coming if I get like one of those swirly chairs like on The Voice where you can be like, that was a rule, not a boundary. Like,
does somebody have an email for Netflix? We'll get this running. We'll get the entire 5% of America that is polyamorous to watch it.
And disagree about it.
Yeah, they'll all be super angry. It'll get tons of engagement.
I mean, it would be great for ratings.
It's my other idea is an entire non-monogamy version of The Amazing Race. So everybody's like traveling around the world, hooking up with each other, forming new partnerships. Just the chaos would be out of control.
Amazing.
So if I ever get to meet Phil Kogan, that's my pitch for him.
Perfect.
I love this.
Perfect.
Okay.
All right. Well, thank you both. Again, a reminder, please, links are in the show notes to go grab a copy of Laura's book. If it is out when this comes out, if it is not, it will be to pre-order it, and then I will update the link when it's time to order it.
It should be out when this comes out because it's out in 5 days.
It will be out. Perfect. So when Laura said that, it was more than 5 days ago. So go get your copy of this book. And
this is awesome.
And again, a reminder, you can find links to all of Laura's work and Meshai's work over on our website, normalizingnonmonogamy.com. Click on the podcast tab and you'll see show notes there for every single episode. There's also a tab up there under the podcast tab for the Ask Us Anything episodes where you can go listen to the last 10 of these that came before this one. And anything that either of you want to throw out into the world before we head away for the weekend.
Thank you so much for having me. If folks want to learn more about polyamorous finances or breakups or raising children in a polyamorous household, please check out Monogamy in This Economy.
Oh my goodness, I was so excited.
Perfect. I love it. And
amen. I feel like that's a prayer. Is that not like a prayer that we all pray? Like monogamy in this economy? Like, come on. Like what's happening here? Yes.
T-shirts too.
She has a t-shirt. I need that t-shirt.
I sell them on my website.
Done.
So get yourself a shirt, get yourself a book.
Yes. And then write us some questions, right. Okay? Because I know you're going to have some.
And the application for our game show should be available soon. All right. Any final thoughts, Meshai?
No, this was brilliant. Thank you so much for coming. This has been a great informational hour. I took notes. I loved it. It was nice to talk to somebody about the finance piece where you're not feeling like you're intruding on someone else's like personal space. So this was wonderful.
Yeah. I have one final thought that just kind of popped into my mind, which is money is always such a taboo topic and talking about it is always so taboo. And I would say if you can, not necessarily within your polycule or anything like that, but if you can cultivate a friendship or a relationship with somebody where you can be really honest and transparent about money and talk about it with somebody in a way that maybe you never have, it can really help sort of, again, normalize it, sort of de-shame, remove the shame around it. I would say this is something I've had for at least the last decade or more. One of my best friends, we sit and we talk about all of the nuts and bolts, like how much we made, how much money we have in different accounts, how did we do this, what tax strategies. And so there's being able to do that with somebody is really helpful when you're maybe feeling alone, or you're like, I screwed something up, and you're like, but who do I talk to? I don't want to go spend $200 an hour to talk to a CPA. Let me talk to this person. At least I can talk about it. And I think it's also a good muscle to flex, is like talking about these uncomfortable things. So those are just my own opinions about money, because again, I love talking about money. So, all right, I will leave it there.
Okay.
And tell everybody to have a wonderful weekend, and we'll see you all next Wednesday for a regularly scheduled episode, and in a month for episode 12 of this. And also, we've got Laura coming back at some point in the next few months to talk about moving in and cohabiting. Got it right this time.
I'll be there.
Awesome. All right. Bye, everybody. Thank you for listening.
Bye.